Yes. Okay, so welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight, depending on where you are in Canada. Today's webinar all others in this web series is brought to you from the following organizations: the Rett Syndrome Society of British Columbia, Rett Syndrome Society of Alberta, Manitoba Rett Syndrome Association, Saskatchewan Rett Syndrome Association, and the Ontario Rett Syndrome Association. We'd like to, tonight we have Shelley Moore, originally from Edmonton and now based in Vancouver, British Columbia. Shelley Moore is a highly sought after teacher, researcher, speaker, and storyteller, and has worked with the school districts and community organizations around the world in supporting and promoting equity for all learners. Her first book, entitled One Without the Other, was released in July 2016 to follow up her TEDx talk. Shelley completed an undergraduate degree in special education at the University of Alberta, her master's at Simon Fraser University, and is currently a PhD candidate at the University of British Columbia. And without further ado, I will hand it over to Shelley.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Nice to see you. Nice to see you. Let me share my screen. Okay, we're recording. The other day I started my session without recording. We had to do it all over again. Okay, so welcome everyone. I'm so excited to spend a little bit of time with you today with some of my favorite people in the audience. A big shout out to my friends. Just before we start, I just want to let you know, usually I get a question around if you have access to the slides or the handouts, and absolutely you do. So if you're social media, here are my handles. On the bottom, you'll see blogsomemore.com, which is the website that I post all my handouts. So if you go there, there's a button that says handouts. And if you click that, everything's organized by date. And these ones are already there. So if you want to download them, they're available for you. The other thing that I would like to just share before we begin is just share a little bit about the place where I'm joining you from today. So I am honored to be joining you from the traditional, unceded, and ancestral territory of Squamish Nation, specifically Nekwellicum, which is known also today as Bowen Island. So I used to live in Vancouver, and then I moved because Vancouver is very expensive. And so, and I have like 2 dogs and like a baby now and a wife. And so we needed like a little bit more space. And so this is the first place I've lived that I had like a yard. And because I grew up in Edmonton and we always lived in apartments. And so this was, the first time that I've actually had access to land as a part of my home. And it was a pretty incredible feeling to know, like even just like to care for land and to understand the land, and also it being land that I didn't grow up with. Like, I'm from Alberta. It's very different landscape here, but moving to this place really aligned with the beginning of my own reconciliation journey and understanding my role as a steward of this land and as a settler on this land. And so it's something that's near and dear to my heart, because if the work that I do is around inclusive education. And the more that I learn about reconciliation and the more that I learn about inclusive education, the more that I realize that they really do go hand in hand. They are one in each other. And so if you would like to acknowledge the place where you are joining from today, please feel free to do so in the chat box. And if you're not sure what territory you're on, that's going to be your homework. That's going to be your homework, because it's a very important and very easy first step that we can do to start understanding the role that the land has in our own lives. Yes, thank you. Questions, if anything comes up, put it in the chat box. Okay, you ready? So here's the thing. If you've seen me present before, you know that I always start with this question. What is this big word, inclusion? Now, I didn't want today to be about, like, we're not going to do like what this means, because if you, I think most of you know what I think inclusion is, but I want to make sure that we're on the same page. So I'm going to do the quick version, because I also want to talk about kind of not just how it's evolved, but I just think we talk a lot about it, and it's time we actually talk about how to do it, because we just talk and talk and talk and talk and talk about inclusion, and there's not enough action. So I'm changing my approach. Here's my one slide. Now, you know me, I could talk about this one slide for hours, but basically, if you were to ask me, like Jo, she saw me present years ago, right? And, at that time, if you were to ask me what inclusion was, I would have said, like, how do we include students with disabilities into general education classrooms? Like, that was my definition for a very, very long time. And then over time, I realized, wait a second, this is more than just disability, right? Like, disability is one entity of many. It's not just about like trying to make one person conform or change who they are, which I feel like is the direction that special education has like totally gone into. It's like you have to change a fundamental part of yourself to fit in. And I'm like, that's not inclusion to me. And so then I kind of got to this new place where it was, well, what if inclusion was, just responding to and teaching to diversity that includes disability, but just is acknowledging that disability is one of many diversities, including race and culture and gender and language. And maybe the goal isn't to make everybody the same. Maybe the goal is to help kids be brighter, find their colors. But then I realized, well, wait a second, how do you teach to diversity we need to know who the kids are, but what if the kids don't know who they are, right? And this is especially relevant to the disability community, where so often disability is not seen as an identity, it's seen as a deficit. And so with most kids that I work with, it's not very often that I hear students being proud of their disability, because it's not seen as an identity. And so this is what I really realized, when I'm understanding what inclusion is. Well, inclusion, yes, of course, it's about responding to diversity, but it's also helping kids to identify who they are, whether that is culture, race, gender, language, sexuality, or disability, and for people to be proud of that, which means that the conditions need to be safe and celebratory for kids who are connecting with those identities. And so this makes sense conceptually, but my goal then is in classrooms, when one student sees an example of someone with autism, that they can look at that and say, hey, that's like me, and be proud of that, not be something that they're ashamed of, which is how disability is treated in so many ways. And so I know that that I'm doing a lot of work with IEPs, because this became a big question is, well, how do you support the development of identity if almost all our resources go into trying to change disability? Because from the medical model of special education, disability is not seen as an identity at all. Yet many of our special education systems are reliant on disability as being a deficit. So like, there's some really counteractive movements and initiatives here. And so a goal that I really had was, okay, well, how do we do this? And then if we're going to have IEPs, how do they evolve to align more with what the goal of inclusion is today, and not what the goal of inclusion was even 5 years ago, right? So to explain this to you, of course, I'm going to tell you a story, because that's how I learn. So here's a picture of me. I'm in Hong Kong. This building here, this is called the Monster Building. And this building was on the top of things that I wanted to see in Hong Kong. Okay, so I was invited to Hong Kong the December before COVID. And I was super excited. My wife was super excited. And so we booked our flights. This is before we have our daughter. So we were much more free back then. But I was all excited. I was all excited to go. And this is the first I've been invited to a conference outside of North America. Okay, now I'm a pretty confident traveler. I travel all the time. Well, I mean, I did before COVID. But what I started to notice about Hong Kong is that I became less confident because I became less independent. Okay, so because I started to notice there were some barriers around me. So for example, the first barrier I noticed when I tried to go to Hong Kong was that there was a language barrier. Makes sense, right? I don't speak the language that is commonly spoken in, or languages that are commonly spoken in Hong Kong. And that's not something that I can like change overnight. Like between the time that I was invited and the time that I was there, like I can't just like become fluent, right? There's nothing really I can do about that. And so I noticed that there were some language barriers and I wasn't understanding and I was less independent. Well, it's a good thing. The organization that booked me, they anticipated this. And so they provided me a translator. I'm like, oh, that's so nice. I feel so supported. And then I tried to rent a car because I like to be independent. And the guy at the booth, he's like, you can't rent a car. I'm like, yes, I can. He's like, no, you don't have the right license. And he goes, even if you did, you don't want to rent a car here. I'm like, why? He's like, because there are rules of the road, and then there are rules of the road, and you don't know them. He goes, you need a driver. I'm like, a driver? Well, it's a good thing the organization that brought me there anticipated this, and they provided me a driver. I didn't even know it. They were waiting there the whole time. I was like, wow, I feel so supported. So then the day the conference comes, and I'm trying to I show up at the conference hall, and I'm like, whew, this is very busy. And I'm trying to figure out where to go. And I'm like kind of getting lost, and I'm all like stressing out. And then one of the organizers is like, Shelley, no, come here. We have a host for you. And I'm like, what? So at the end of the day, I realized that I have an interpreter, a driver, and a host. I basically have 3 one-on-one Hong Kong EAs to help me out. And it was fantastic. I was like, oh, this is so nice. But I also realized that because I was so supported, I also didn't really do anything for myself. And so I realized, the fine line between being over supported, because I also didn't, honestly, I didn't do anything for myself. There was a moment where I was just really tired and not feeling well. And so I was like, because jet lag gets to me, right? So I'm like, I had a few hours before my next session. So I'm like, is there a place that I can just kind of sit and just relax a bit? So they take me to this lounge, and all 3 of my helpers are sitting there with me. And I'm like, you guys can go. They're like, no, we're here for you. And I'm like, cool. Thanks, I'm just gonna be over here. It was almost too much. It was almost too much. But I realized a few things. Okay, so the first thing I realized is this is what we do. This is what special education does. If someone has a need, we're like, give them a person. Give them a person. And first of all, there's not enough people for that. First problem. Second problem is the more people I got, the less things I did for myself. Second problem. And this is why people think inclusion is really expensive. Because that is really, really expensive. Now, the other thing I realized is this. I am the same person in Hong Kong as I am in Edmonton, as I am in Toronto, as I am in Phoenix. I'm the same person, exact same person. And what I realized is that my independence was less in Hong Kong than it is in Edmonton, not because of something that's wrong with me, but because there's barriers around me. Okay, now the reason why this is important is because when I think about kids, it's like every class they go to and every person they interact with, it's kind of like they're in a different country, right? But if we put all of our resources into the individual, we're not actually paying attention to any of the barriers in the context. Now, not to say people aren't important. There's absolutely a need for people, and there is a need for one-on-one. But if even with one-on-one support, if we don't attend to the barriers within the context, the independence of the person becomes less and less and less, and the resources that a person needs becomes more and more and more. And so this helped me understand so much about the alternative, because you realize that for many, many, many children or students, just people in the world, they're immediately seen as something's wrong when they're not successful or independent, instead of actually taking a step back and saying, wait a second, what if it's not them that's the problem? What if it's the barriers around? What if that's just an indicator that there's something that's off around them? Okay, so this is really important, because this is shifting then how IEPs are thought of. Okay, so I'm going to show this to you visually, okay, because you realize that we've all been taught this. So I want you to imagine a place. This can be a classroom, this can be public transportation, this can be a swimming pool, okay? Imagine a place, and how all of us were taught as students, and if you were an educator out there, we were taught this medical model of disability, which is if a person is not having success in a place, something's wrong with them. Now, not having success looks a variety of ways, but one of them could be increase of anxiety, lack of engagement, increase in challenging behavior, non-attendance. Like there's many ways to see that a student is not having success, okay? So from the special education perspective, we're like, okay, well, something's wrong. We have to find out what's wrong. So then we use resources to assess them. So from the medical model of disability, it's the thing about like the doctor. You go to the doctor when something is wrong, and if they can't diagnose and fix you, they send you to a specialist. Like this whole approach to learning has been applied to learning, okay? Now, these assessments are very expensive, and they also don't happen in the context, even though that's where the problem is happening, first problem. And so then what we have been trained to do is, okay, let's find out what's wrong with the person, diagnose them, create a plan for them so they can be fixed, and then they're ready to go back into the place where they were having the problem. Well, as you can see, you're probably sitting there like, this is nonsense. And you're right. It's absolute nonsense, because we're putting, like, the education system puts all of their resources into this model. And I mean, first of all, there's so many problems, but one of the main problems is IEPs require some of the largest resources in the education system, but they're following a process that's totally outdated. Like IEPs weren't even designed to be used in inclusive settings. And so now we're trying to use them in settings and trying to be inclusive at the same time, but then these plans are completely disconnected from the place where kids are actually having the problem. So it's all of these resources, and what's ended up happening is the IEPs are not very useful. They're not useful to the actual context where kids are having the problem. Plus, the disability community is like, hi, I'm not broken. I like myself just the way I am. I don't want to be like you. I mean, it's shocking to hear sometimes. When I was learning about the social model of disability, I kept thinking about my own experience of coming out, right? Like when I was a young Shelley Moore, realizing that I was a young little gay, and starting to tell people, like my family, they were like, we'll pray for you. And I'm like, why? I mean, you can if you want, but like, don't pray about the gay thing. I really like being gay. It's quite fantastic. Well, I mean, like, I don't want to be like you. I actually like the way I am. And I felt such kinship with my disabled friends who are like, totally, Shelley, I'm the exact same way. Like, my learning disability actually gives me like a unique perspective on the world. And my friends, oh my goodness, I love that I have autism. Like, people who have disabilities, they don't see the disability, like, it's a part of who they are. It's their identity. And so now they're trying to exist in a school system that sees that disability as a deficit instead of this identity. So then what's the solution? Because people with disabilities still might have needs, but how do you respond to the needs without changing fundamentally who they are? Do you see how it doesn't match? It doesn't fit together. It doesn't fit together. So the amount of resources that go into a system that's actually completely unethical is not, it's absolute nonsense. We would never do this for any other identity. Okay, so let's take a breath. So what's the alternative? Well, the disability community has been advocating for this for years, forever, which is, friends, if I'm not having success, I am not the problem. Y'all are the problem. Because if I'm not having success, that means that there's barriers around me. It's not because something's wrong with me. Okay. And we know this to be the social model of disability. So when I talk to teachers about this, like, my favorite metaphor, it's not my metaphor, I just build on it. You've probably heard it before, where the difference between the social and the medical model is if you have a flower in a garden and the flower is dying, the flower is wilting. It's so easy as a gardener just to cut it out and compost it. So easy. There, my garden looks good again. But if you just cut out a flower that's dying without actually asking why it's dying, other flowers are also going to have a hard time, right? Because if a flower is not like thriving, it's because it needs water, it needs space, it needs light, or it's getting eaten by slugs. Like, it's not the flower's problem. These are things in the soil and in the environment around them. And so from the social model of disability, it says, if we have a child or an individual or a student that is not having success in a place, and this is any place, what if instead of finding out what's wrong with the person, we find out what's wrong with the place? Let's, instead of diagnosing the person, we diagnose the garden. We're like, what's missing in the garden? Because the benefit of actually targeting the garden is that you target all the flowers in the garden. So this is where the efficiency comes in, because if one person is having a hard time, it is very, very possible that there are 5 other kids who are also close to having a hard time. Okay, so if we can respond to the needs, then we're responding to everyone. So the social model says, let's look around individuals to find out what's going on and reduce the barriers, and then everyone benefits. But then teachers are like, nope, that doesn't work. And I'm like, what do you mean? So I was sharing this story with a group, and the teachers are like, nope, this doesn't work. This model doesn't work. And I'm like, why? And they're like, well, because I don't just have a garden of one kind of flower. I don't just have daisies. I have daisies and hostas and blueberry bush and some eggplants. And I have some very temperamental orchids. And I also have plants that blooms like once every 15 years for 11 seconds. Like, all my plants need different things. So the social model doesn't work. And I had to really think about this, because I understood their point. Because if we're really going to like respond to diversity, then we have to also make the metaphor work for diverse plants. So then I did some digging, because I'm like, it's true, there's a flaw. So then I found my favorite researcher, Michael Waymire, my favorite. And he suggests a third option. Okay. And he kind of combines the two. But he changes the model from a disability model to a needs-based model. Because if you're responding to needs, that frees disability up to be an identity. Okay. Plus, everybody has needs. So you can respond to needs without the goal being to change the person. You with me? Okay. So in the person-place model, which I actually think should be called the place-person model, because in the person-place model, Michael Waymire says, how about if a person is not having success, then we can pretty much assume that there's other people who are also not having success, but are not, they're just like not in as much crisis. Like, it's never just one person. So let's first assess the environment. Let's first look around and be like, what are some barriers that are in the way? And that will bring down the crisis. And there's barriers in every single classroom. Every single classroom in every single school in the whole world has barriers, just because the system wasn't designed to be equitable and inclusive. So you can have the most inclusive educator in the world. There will always be barriers. And so because there will always be barriers, we can always anticipate how to reduce them. Okay. Once we bring the crisis down, then we can actually look at who is in our community and say, okay, now what are the needs? What are the needs? Not the disabilities. What are the needs of the group? Because if you have 5 kids with autism in a group, you have 5 kids with autism. You know what I mean? Like, disability is not homogenous, right? Like, even within the Rett syndrome community, you're going to have diversity of disability. And so going from a needs-based model, you can actually be like, okay, well, what are the needs of this community? Because then you can actually be responsive to the individuals instead of just saying, everyone needs this. Okay, so then the question is, well, what's the purpose of IEPs then? Okay, you ready? So this is the vision for IEPs, is if we're going to have IEPs and we're going to advocate for inclusive classrooms, they need to work together. This can't be something that you apply after the fact. This has to be part of the plan of the community. Okay. So the work that I've been doing around IEPs is, well, what if IEPs were not a plan to fix? No, that's not the goal. The goals that people should be meeting in a classroom community are goals that are connected to what everyone is meeting in a classroom community, right? So whether that's curriculum or competencies, or like, focusing on growth, focusing on how are we growing and working together. Those are not based in deficits. Because I think of like, so many IEPs are like, where should you be and how do we get you there? I kind of imagine it as IEPs being, where are you now and where could you go? It's totally possibility oriented instead of what's wrong with you oriented, okay? The other part about an IEP is, if you go back to the garden metaphor, if our teachers are the gardeners, it's very possible that a gardener doesn't know absolutely every single thing about every single kind of different plant. And so we have little guides. So if I buy a package of seeds, on the package, it tells me the individual and unique needs of that plant. It's not about changing the flower. It's about how do you change the environment so that the flower can bloom. So it'll tell you how much shade it needs. It'll tell you how much space it needs. It'll tell you some companion plants. Every package does this. So then I'm thinking, what if an IEP was like a seed package? It's designed for a specific need, designed for an individual, but it's not about how to change the plant. It's about what conditions do we need to create around the person so that they can thrive, so that they can grow, so that they can bloom, but also within a garden with other plants. And so when I see IEPs, I think the goals are to grow, not to be restored or remediated. The goals are to grow. And it also becomes a blueprint to say, anyone who has this need, these are things that you can do in the environment to increase success for that plant to grow, to increase success for an individual to grow and to move. So this has been the work, and I've been working with BC, and I've been working with Northwest Territories and the Yukon, Manitoba, because these questions are all about the same thing. Is people know that IEPs need to shift, and they know that we're moving into more inclusive classrooms and schools, but the IEPs they have to evolve. They have to. Otherwise, we're using resources in really non-optimal ways that could actually be going towards supporting the community. Now, the other question I often get is, well, what about if people do have individual needs? And that's very possible. Absolutely, people can have individual needs. And so one part of the IEP is also looking at supports and strategies that an individual needs, as which are universal, meaning which ones can be applied to the context, and which ones are essential, which are individual to a person. So for example, like an augmentative communication device, that's not a universal support. Like, that's an essential individualized support. However, modeling and teaching how to use it and not having it locked up in a cupboard is what you can do in the environment to increase that support, right? So it's almost like a blueprint for a teacher to say, okay, what do I need to do? What does the student need to do? And how do we create conditions so that success is increased? So I think it's pretty exciting. I have a whole course designed on this. Like, you're getting the really fast version of this, but probably one of the biggest hurdles or barriers that we encountered in BC was people saw the new IEP and saw it as just a change in template. But if you look at it as from the perspective of the medical model, it's very hard to do. It's very hard to do. It doesn't actually make a lot of sense. And so I thought today what we would talk about is not just show you the template, but to say, this is how we're viewing the process differently, right? It's not just a change in template, but actually viewing students differently and building plans in connection to a community rather than an isolated document that's applied after the fact. And so I know there's probably so many questions, but this is the part that is where the work is, right? Like, what does this look like? What does this mean? How do we do this? How does this fit? But I can tell you, it's the feedback that we've been getting is that it's much easier for teachers because it's useful, right? They're not just documents that are made and then put into a filing cabinet for 5 months, but they're useful. Students are more involved, which we know is really important. Like the self-determination research is that students are more, and families are more involved in the process. It centers student voice as the most important piece of data, not diagnostic assessments done by someone who you've met once. So I mean, like there's some really big changes that I'm pretty excited about. And I think it's a relief for a lot of kids and families who are just, I remember there was one parent that I talked to and she just said, I'm just so tired of coming to school to learn about all the things that my kid can't do. And that's kind of stuck with me because I'm like, that is not what school should be. Okay, I'm gonna pause because I want to give you a chance to ask some questions. Okay, I'm just kind of wondering, like, so there's 6 of you. Would it be helpful to have a little breakout group to kind of brainstorm or come up with a question together and then come back so that I'm not just putting you on the spot? That's what I usually do with my groups. And then you can kind of talk to each other a little bit. Or if you have questions ready to go, we can just like go into it. What do you think?
We can do whichever you would like, Shelley.
Okay, well, why don't we do like maybe like a 3-minute, I'll put you in 2 breakout groups and you can just kind of like talk and listen to each other in terms of some possible questions. And then if each group comes up with one question, you're so funny. How do I clone you? If each breakout group could come up with one question, and then that'll probably take us to the end of our time. Oh, can you make me co-host? Let's see here. Because then I can do the breakout groups. There we go. Is it Christinia? Okay, no problem. No problem. We don't have to have breakout groups. I'm not the host, so I can't do it. Okay, hold on. Okay. No problem. Okay, so I'm just gonna leave it open.
Shelley, I was on mute. I was trying to talk.
Oh no, that's okay. You know how to make me a
co-host, but I don't know how to make you a co-host.
Oh, that's okay. So you're gonna go to the participant list.
Yep.
And then hover over my name. It says more.
Yep.
And then it'll say make co-host.
It just says host only. Doesn't say.
Oh, then that's fine too. That's fine too.
Okay. It won't.
It won't do it.
Well, I'm just wondering about the recording part.
Oh, it'll keep going.
Okay. There you go.
Woo! Look at us learning. Okay, we're gonna try this. Why isn't it? Oh no, you know what? Breakout groups are not an option. Okay, you know what, friends? The breakout groups are just not working. They're just not working today. Okay, so what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna let you guys come up with a question for the chat box. And while you're doing that, yeah, pivot. While you are typing a question in the chat box, I'm going to show you something that I show educators, that I show teaching teams, okay? So your job is to type a question. My job is I'm going to show you a resource, okay? So when I do this work with schools, what I talk about is 2 barriers. Remember I told you there's barriers in every classroom. Well, these 2 barriers, we know what they are. The first one is every classroom in school has learning barriers, and every classroom in every school has barriers to equity. And because we know that those exist, because the school system was not designed to be equitable and inclusive. It was designed to stream, it was designed to be competitive, it was designed to homogenize. And so pushing back on these 2 things are very important for inclusion and for reconciliation, okay? So one resource that I show teams to be like, what are some ways that we can reduce barriers? So I speak to, and this is the other thing too, is it's important to stay in your lane. And so I can speak to disability, I can speak to queerness, I can speak about being a woman, but I can't talk about race, right? So I can show you strategies on disability, but this is also where I tell all my teams, like, seek out Indigenous scholars and Black scholars and, you know, like disabled scholars, like people who live this world, and listen to them. Like, what do they say that you can do to reduce barriers? Okay, so the one that I can speak to is disability, like specifically around learning disability. And so as we know, strategies to reduce disability for learning are deeply connected in the research around universal design for learning. And so one resource that I show teams is, there's three parts of our brain that we need to learn. The first one is we need to care, we need to be engaged. The second one is we have to understand. And the third one is we have to share. We have to be able to share our learning out and be able to communicate that in some way. And so what UDL does is it gives you all of these different strategies for how to do that. So how do you get kids to be engaged? So green is engagement. How do you get kids to be engaged? You can help them be interested. You can help them stay motivated, and you can help them cope with the big emotions that happen when learning is hard. Now, the problem with UDL is that UDL is not written for families or teachers. It's written for researchers at Harvard, because that's where the research institute is. So a lot of people don't use it because the language is not accessible. It's very jargony. And so one day when I was on a 7-hour plane ride and I got really frustrated, I translated it into like teacher language and hopefully family language. It's because all of these things are strategies that people can advocate for, and they're all shown to reduce barriers to learning. And so the more we can reduce barriers, the more success kids are going to have. So for example, one really big one is if a student is having a hard time with a particular activity, there is no activity that's mandated in the curriculum, in any curriculum across Canada. And so one thing that families can advocate for is there another activity that I can do to meet this goal, right? And so giving kids choice and control over what the activity is, that's an example. Connecting what they're learning to their lives. So if your child is having a hard time, you can be like, hey, is there an example of how this connects to their real life? Because just making something connect to us as individuals is going to make it more accessible. This one here, I love this one, is so many times kids will be like, why are we learning this? Why? Like they don't know the why. They just see it as a task they have to complete. One thing we can do to reduce learning barriers is actually to clearly communicate what the learning goals are to kids. So as a family, as a parent, like you have every right to just be like, okay, this activity, what's the actual learning goal that you're evaluating? Because there's different ways that you can do that. So if you know the why, you can also find another path. And so I'm kind of toying around in my head. This one was made for teachers, but like how useful it would be to kind of be like almost like parent and family and self-advocate kind of like probing questions, to just be like, how do we advocate for an individual or for yourself around how to make something more accessible? But none of these things actually are adaptations or modifications. They're just like reducing barriers. Like they're about what's around a student instead of actually changing the student. And so all of these, so I have it for engagement, I have it for understanding, and I have it for expression. And so I'm kind of toying around with like, what would this look like almost as a support for families and self-advocates to use so that they can advocate for themselves in terms of how to reduce barriers to learning. There's a whole bunch of resources around barriers to equity, but this is the only real one for learning, and it's not super accessible. So I'm kind of just playing around with that idea in my mind. But if you're ever not sure, I'll post these, because in any curriculum across Canada, any teacher can implement any one of these strategies, and it's allowed. Like it's not compromising the integrity of a learning standard. It's not an adaptation. It's not a modification. Like it's something that it's within guidelines to do. It's endorsed, I guess is the word I'm trying to say, by curriculum experts. So, but if you don't know if you don't know what you're allowed to advocate for or what to advocate for in terms of learning, then often what happens is we kind of resort to what we think we know, which is often like one-to-one EAs, or you know what I mean? Like there's just so many things that can help the actual learning part of it. I don't know. I feel like I'm rambling a little bit, but so that's kind of the work that I'm doing is, the biggest, how do we reduce the barriers to learning so that then we can then zoom in and look at the individual needs connected to an IEP. But a lot of people think that a lot of these strategies have to be on the IEP. They don't. They're just like strategies in the environment. Okay, I don't see any questions coming up. Oh, you have your question, Joe. Okay, I'm ready. Oh, Joe, you got to unmute. Oh, you're pasting it. Okay, no problem, no problem. Paste deleted. Okay, here we go. Joe's got a question. Joe has the best questions. How do you get educators to buy into this model? Oh, that's not Joe. Okay, Joe, while you're pasting, I'll answer this one. So here's the thing. When I was school-based, I would get really mad at teachers. I would get really mad at them because I believe that they were like fundamentally against inclusion, especially as kids get older in high school. I was like, why? Like, this is a human right. Why aren't you being inclusive? Like, it's so possible. And then I realized that, like, well, wait a second, what if we view this the same way as we do with kids? Like, why aren't teachers having success? Why aren't they feeling independent? What's the barriers that are in the way for them? And I really thought about it because I'm just like, how do we reduce barriers for educators to be able to shift to this type of a model? And so there's things that we can do in terms of policy, right? Which I think does play a role. There's also some things that we can do in terms of kind of, and I like the word infrastructure, is that what infrastructural conditions can we put into place? Because if the infrastructure is there, people will choose what's easier, right? And so like the believers will buy in. And so that's actually not the audience that I target whenever I do sessions. I think we got to make the non-believers buy in, which means, and how we do that is we have to show them that it's easier than what's already happening. And so, for example, to make this easier for teachers, we know that the research says that it's going to take time. So we can't see this as like a one-time PD that teachers come to once and they never see again, right? Like, this has to be, like, the research around professional development is this is something that is a part of professional development over time, right? Another barrier is that teachers have never seen it in action. They haven't seen it in real life. And so that is finding, and so one thing that I do with schools is we'll find case study classrooms and we'll build exemplars, like exemplar case studies that show parents and to show educators that it's possible and that kids have so much success. So like there's these little bitty things. Another thing is teachers can't do this by themselves. That this is a model that relies on collaboration, right? And so like, how are we supporting classroom teachers and support workers and special education teachers to work together? So like there's a lot of moving parts, but it is happening. And as curriculum becomes more updated, it's pulling more of these big ideas in. So like in BC, for example, our curriculum is no longer standardized. Like that's going to create more flexibility for curriculum to be flexible for all abilities. They're considering moving to a needs-based model, which will support and free up disability to be an identity, right? So there's these little infrastructural conditions. We're moving in the right way. COVID has put a wrench in everybody's plans. It's like we've gone back in time like 100 years, but I do think that knowing what to advocate for is probably one of the biggest skills or like characteristics we can teach self-advocates and parents and families and teachers, so that you know what you're advocating for. Otherwise, we'll advocate for what we know, which sometimes doesn't align with the model. But it's a very good question. But my favorite piece of advice that was ever given to me was go with the goers, and the goers will grow. I spent a lot of time trying to change people's minds until I realized that you can't change people's minds. But if you bring all the people together who are believers, they will grow. They will grow. Okay, Joe's question, how do you get people to address the intersectionality in IEPs? I know. We are just trying to get people to understand that being disabled is okay, but what if people are gay and disabled or Indigenous, gay and disabled? I love this question. So there's some work by Leighton Schneller, who is a very good friend and colleague. And he taught me a lot about the importance of identity, and specifically around how we can pull identity in as a part of the individual education plan process. Because exactly, Joe, what you say is that people aren't just disabled. Just like someone isn't just queer, like that we have multiple parts about who we are. And so I think part of the IEP that we have kind of developed, often IEPs are about kids instead of by students. And so part of that is understanding that if we want students to develop their multiple identities, they have to be a part of the process, but it also has to be safe for students to declare what their identity is. There's no way. It was not safe for me to do that. And so having a process that allows the school community to say, who are you? To be able to A, ask the question, but B, pay attention to the context so that it makes it safe to answer that question. Because I think if we talk about the intersectionality, especially when the multiple identities are all identities that have been marginalized historically, it's got to be extra safe, right? And so I think I don't even know if I'm if I'm answering the question, but I think to address intersectionality in IEPs, they have to be created by the student. They have to stop being created for a student. And we have to respect when people don't identify, because often it's because of safety, but that can give us a pretty good clue. Like I always think when I was working with a student, if a student doesn't say, when I ask a student who they are, and they don't say that they have a disability when it's obvious that they do, that tells me that it's not safe for them to identify that. And so what my job then as an educator is to create a context where not only is that okay, but it's something to be celebrated. And so I think, if I have a student who I think is gay, if I have a student who is Indigenous, if I have a student who is a woman, whatever identities I see represented, that's a clue for me as an educator to say, I need to make sure that these identities are represented. And so if we can get students to self-identify, that will just help even more communicate to a community the importance of seeing who students are within the curriculum that they're learning. I feel like I'm just babbling, Joe. I don't know if I answered that question. But I just see safety. It's got to be safe, and we have to get the people's voice in there. We will never know what the identities are. Christinia, when advocating, families are being told something different from research-based information. Oh, that is so true. That is so true. How do we change the minds of people such as skills teachers, principals? How do we make it easier? Honestly, I'm a new parent and I'm terrified for this. I'm terrified. I am terrified for my child to go to school and be taught according to practices that are not research-based and are outdated. I fear for me. I fear for the teacher. I fear for the school, because it kills me, because I just want to rage, but I can't. We have to be strategic. And it's hard. It is so hard. Like, as an educator, I can say, no problem. I'm just going to work with the people who are following research. But as a parent, you can't. You don't have that luxury. You don't have the privilege to just choose the teacher that your kid is working with. And then if you see they have the context in the situation where it's actually detrimental to your child, like, I don't know how people just don't go full mama bear. Well, or I understand why they do go full mama bear or papa bear, because it is. Advocating is a huge struggle. Absolutely. Right, exactly. Especially when we get it on an SLP report with a box checked off, our child displays weaknesses in speech articulation. Like, And that's exactly it. It's completely inappropriate. No, I get it. I understand why everybody goes full mama bear, especially now that I'm a parent. I think like when I'm in those situations where people are saying things like weaknesses, I will stop them and just be like, what are their strengths? What are their interests? What do you know about them that they love? What's their mother's name? Like, you know what I mean? Like, sometimes it requires a full stop in the conversation to just be like, no, that's not how we talk anymore. That's not how we talk about kids, right? Joe says, maybe don't let little Meta come to school in Alberta, then our education system sucks right now. What research? I know Alberta is struggling, but there's anything about Albertans is that they are hardy people. And I have to trust that Alberta is going to come out on top, because Albertans are no nonsense people. And right now it's nonsense. And I just feel like people are going to be like, enough. And so I just have to trust Joe that the education system is going to come out at the other end of this dark time. They have to. Otherwise I am making everyone move to BC. I don't know how you're doing it, but I know that I'm working with a lot of Alberta schools right now who are really struggling, and it's so frustrating because research is important. It is. We learn about kids, and I think it's totally realistic to advocate for research-based practices. And I think it's totally realistic to expect teachers to engage in professional development that aligns with equity and inclusion. And I think that's an expectation that should be held very high. So my friends, I don't even know if that was helpful, but I don't even know. Oh, Trish, you're so lovely. If you want to learn more specifically about the IEP, I do have a course, and it's like, you could listen to me talk for days. But it talks a lot about the rationale. It talks, there's a part of it. I did for my master's, I included a study that interviewed parents, and just kind of talked about some of the barriers that parents are experiencing. So if you are interested in really digging in, I know that a lot of families are taking that course just to help them with their advocacy, so that they know what to specifically ask for, to be like, hey, so, and plus to give yourself some like say, hey, this is happening in BC, how can we pull this in to systems in other parts of Canada? Because it just feels a little relieving to have something different when the system is so entrenched in deficit. And it's exactly what who said it? H. Hollick said it's totally inappropriate. We just would never talk like that about any other.
It's Holly.
What is it?
Holly.
Holly C. Got it. I'm like Holly C. I get it. Just like Holly says, it's totally inappropriate. And I just say over and over and over again, disability is an identity. Just sing it over and over, and just be like, so would you say that about race? Would you say that statement about culture? No, you wouldn't. So sometimes people get mad at me, but I just sometimes can't take it anymore. Anyways, friends, thank you so much for spending time with me today. I have had a lovely evening. Once we figured all the technology. Any lingering comments or questions before we go have some dinner? Hi, Holly.
I have something to share. I've got my picture, but
hi.
So we've been fighting about a communication forum to come home about Olive's Day, and we've kind of had firm no's, and it's from the principal and everyone, but the OT and the PT with the district have decided to take it to the director of support services and present it as a document that they want all to be filled out with all nonverbal kids or all category A kids.
Right.
So they're trying to remove it from me because anytime I'm the one advocating, I get shut down, or if I'm asking for something, it gets shut down. So they're going to do it for me, but through the district. So, which is great, but it's so hard to know how, like it's so hard.
Yeah. And I just, especially when it comes to communication, something that I really struggle with is I have a hard time understanding why people think that communication supports are something that are like not essential. You know what I mean? And so like whenever someone's just like, no, we don't need to do that, I always think like, come back to like this is their insulin. You know what I mean? Like this communication system is her insulin. Like, would you deny, like it is an essential part of her success, right? Like, and so really pulling in these obvious examples of this it can't be a choice. Like, what do you need to make this work? Because this is essential for my child. And I just, it gives me hives when I hear that you have been said no to around something so simple.
Yeah, it seems simple to me, and it's having like a reference. It's having a reference for dialogue.
That's exactly it,
school, right? To prompt something.
And you can't just there's some kids you can't just ask them and tell me about your day. So how do we put a system in place so that you can, and I think that's completely reasonable. Do you have a question? Who is this person with great hair?
What is Rett syndrome?
What is Rett syndrome? Do you know what is a really good person to ask that? Someone with Rett syndrome.
Your sister. It's Olive.
Hi, Olive.
There's Shelley, Olive.
Nice to meet you, Olive. And who is
It's Ira? Yeah.
Hi, Ira. Would anybody like to answer Ira's question? Who could answer it better than me? Joe. Joe is a celebrity. So if anyone has a good answer to that question, it's Joe. Ira, how old are you?
6.
And how old is Olive?
Olive is 7.5.
Oh, yeah. So Joe's just typing. Olive is 7.5 and Ira is 6.
Yeah.
What a party you have over there.
It sure is.
And where are you joining us from, Holly and Ira? And
we're in Vernon. We actually
Vernon.
Are you working with Sylvester School right now?
Wait a second, Holly. Are you the one that emailed me?
Yes.
Oh, yeah. This is no.
Are you working with our school or?
I'm working with the district.
Yeah, I heard that. Yeah.
And so I wonder if there's someone.
I know you work with Miss Louisa Cotton. She's our OT.
Okay. You're having a hard time in Vernon?
Yeah.
It's pretty awesome, but
here's the thing. Here's the thing is
exactly. Right now
I have more pull in BC than other places. The tricky thing is it's hard to the reason why I said we have to go through the district, because I remember emailing you, is that if I come from a parent perspective, often people when I come from the district perspective, it's much more like you know what I mean? No one can say no. Like people are just like, okay, this is coming from the district. It's not an option or a choice. Yes, I'm working in Manitoba as well. And so it's almost just like it's like kind of like set as a standard. I'm going to send you a little email, Holly. We'll talk more. Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah. Trish, I am working in Manitoba. The other thing too is that like my specialty area is like curriculum. And so it's also figuring out, where can my work be? Where can my research be best utilized? Shelley needs to be cloned and shipped out. My wife couldn't handle if there was more than one of me, let me tell you. Oh, Joe's just typing.
All right, Joe, are you ready? Yeah.
Okay, Joe.
body is affected by Rett syndrome. My brain knows what I want it to do, but my muscles don't always listen. I understand everything you were saying. I bet Olive does too. Am I right, Olive?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Olive just woke up from a nap, so she doesn't have her communication device.
Thank you, Joe. Okay, my friends, I have had such a good time hanging out with all of you today. And of course, and Ira. Hi, Ira. And Olive. So thank you so much for joining me. I know that it's the nighttime for many of us and dinner time for many of us. So I know that everyone's time is very valuable. So I'm glad that we could be together, even though we have a little bit of a tech hiccup. But I posts that I talked about today in hopes that they can be useful to everyone. And yeah, and I just maybe we'll spend more time together because there's just so much we could talk about. So thank you to everyone. Who's wrapping us up tonight?
That would be me again. So I would like to thank everybody for joining us tonight, and Shelley for your amazing presentation. Just a reminder that today's webinar and all the other webinars in the series was brought to you from the following organizations: the Rett Syndrome Association of British Columbia, Rett Syndrome Society of Alberta, Manitoba Rett Syndrome Association, Saskatchewan Rett Syndrome Association, and the Ontario Rett Syndrome Association. So thank you so much, everybody, for joining us and putting in your questions and interacting. We really appreciate it. It always makes webinars so much more interesting.
Absolutely. Thanks, everyone. Go have a great night. And if you're on spring break, enjoy your spring break. Bye, everyone.